Guns. When guns were first invented, they called them the Great Equalizer. Who were they good for? Who were they bad for?
Well, this is one of these places where I have changed my perspective. I long believed the Second Amendment was the greatest error in our Constitution. I no longer believe that.
This is Dr. Brett Weinstein, an evolutionary biologist and a card-carrying member of the intellectual dark web. He has recently changed his mind on guns, and I'm really happy to hear that. I'm a big fan of Dr. Weinstein. He and I come to very different conclusions. He's a very liberal atheist, and I think it would be an understatement to say that that does not describe me. But that said, he has paid an untold cost over the last handful of years by standing up against the Great Awakening, by standing up for rationality and science in the face of COVID. And to that end, I give him nothing but my highest respect. We're going to jump into his rationale. We're going to clarify some of the ideas that he still holds on to, and then we're going to talk about how to respond to these types of ideas going forward. Let's jump in.
Guns. When guns were first invented, they called them the Great Equalizer. Who were they good for? Who were they bad for?
I love the phrase the Great Equalizer. You need to memorize and use that term. When a woman uses a gun to defend her life, she is 4 times more likely to survive than if she uses anything else. There is really no actual way, aside from guns, to consistently confer a strategic advantage to a smaller opponent when facing a larger, more violent, stronger opponent. Only guns. And that's why we should consider it the equalizer and also be very pro-gun.
I long believed the Second Amendment was the greatest error in our Constitution. I no longer believe that. And it doesn't mean that I look past all of the terrible, unnecessary carnage that arises because guns are easily available. But I'm watching tyranny erupt in places that I never would have expected it. And I am wondering if the founders did not very wisely understand that this day would come and that it will be very hard for tyrants to succeed in America if the populace is armed.
This is called an even so argument, and it is not necessary when we're talking about guns. The way the argument goes is, even though the policy I want leads to these negative outcomes, even so, it's still worth it because there is this greater evil that we're holding at bay. The claim is that he's making is that guns, when they're easily accessible, that it leads to carnage. That's the opposite of what is true. The opposite. In fact, John R. Lott has shown whenever legal concealed handgun licenses go up in an area, violent crime goes down precipitously, and he's accounted for hundreds of variables. Now, that doesn't mean that all guns in an area make an area safer. That isn't true. Guns have to be accumulated in the hands of law-abiding citizens. If they're accumulated in the hands of criminals, then yes, that's when you see certain areas of our nation that have a murder rate that is 26, 27, and even 28 times the national average. But those are the areas where it is very difficult to legally access a firearm. It is still easy in those areas to illegally. Now, the common sense gun reform people will say, but if you make it harder to legally acquire the gun, it will necessarily trickle down and make it harder for bad guys to get those same guns. That is sometimes true. It is frequently not. Imagine fentanyl. It's very difficult to legally acquire it. It is very easy to illegally acquire it.
So again, I know people will hear something in that I'm not saying. The cost of having these weapons commonly available is huge and frankly completely unacceptable to me.
Really?
While guns do lead to a certain number of murders, we have to compare those murders to all the lives saved by guns. The stats show that about 10,000 to 15,000 people are shot to death every single year. At the same time, 10 to 15,000. At the same time, the CDC shows that between 500,000 and 2 million people use guns defensively every single year. Whenever you add to that statistic what we know about the preventative measure of guns, that they decrease the rates of violent crime in areas, whenever you include the fact that women who use them to defend themselves are far more likely to survive attacks, and then let's throw in one more, 96.2% of all mass shootings occur in gun-free zones, the areas that it is the most difficult to legally carry, and in fact, it's impossible to legally carry a gun. Let's use a very simple analogy. Let's go to medical malpractice. You may not know this, but medical malpractice is about the 3rd leading cause of death in America. Depending on how you count it, at least 250,000 Americans die every year due to some form of medical error. And depending on how you count it, it could be as high as 500,000. 440,000. That's wild. Now, nobody would say that this is an okay number of deaths, but the way that we would solve these preventable deaths would not be to limit surgery access or medical access for every other person in the nation in the same way. Whenever you realize that the 10 to 15,000 people who are killed every single year are concentrated in these incredibly high crime gang areas, what you realize is that we need to craft our policy to address that in particular. But we would not even be addressing that issue if we simply made it more difficult for everybody else in the nation to have access to the life-saving technology that is a gun.
Even though I appreciate the tremendous unnecessary cost of these weapons being common, right? Even though I see that cost, I believe nothing will be more destructive than if tyranny, I mean, we've already seen lots of hints of tyranny in recent times in the US, but if tyranny takes over our nation and the West, we are in even more serious trouble. So I believe the harms that do come from these weapons being common will be dwarfed by the harms of things like what we saw in the 20th century in the Soviet Union, for example.
I'm very thankful he's actually talking about tyranny, because this is the very reason we have the amendment. That's the reason it was enumerated, was to defend us against tyranny. Let's say everything else I just said about guns was entirely made up. I just made it all up. It's all a lie. Then his argument stands. Even if the easy access regime leads to 10 to 15,000 people being murdered every year, it's nothing compared to the 30 to 80 million that were killed underneath totalitarian regimes during the 20th century. It's orders of magnitude different. And so this idea that we're seeing tyrannical, power-hungry, totalitarian, authoritarian ideologies on the rise right now, it makes really good sense to make sure that people are defended against that. In fact, the very same people who are the most likely to call their opponents fascists, namely leftists, right? They're going to say all cops are bad, the country is systemically racist, yada, yada. They're the very ones that should be, therefore, the most into the Second Amendment. So how do we respond with wisdom and virtue to these facts? Number one, we need to change our mind about guns if we haven't already. Don't see them as necessary evils. See them as the great equalizers and tyranny preventers that they are. Number two, get a gun. Get numerous guns. There's different guns for different occasions. It's a wonderful hobby to have. It's a great sport. I highly encourage you to get a gun. Carry your gun. Follow the law. Every different area has very different persnickety little infringements on how you're able to actually protect yourself. Follow them, but get your gun, carry a gun. Start with friends. Okay, if you're not used to guns, start with some friends who already have guns. Start with something very easy to shoot, like a 22 rifle. I've seen women get really scared off from guns because they started off with like a 9mm and a very small handgun. They thought it would work better for them because it was smaller, not realizing that meant more recoil. Start with something very easy to shoot and work your way up to something a little harder to shoot. Number four, vote for uncommon sense gun laws. Laws that make it easy for law-abiding citizens to protect themselves and those they love. Number five, share this video. I know it's self-serving, but seriously, this is to help people think rightly about guns. And number six, be a good ambassador. Do not be the kind of person who turns other people off from guns because of your abrasive and brash personality. That's it for today. My name is Ryan Martin, and this is Unsafe Media. If you have not joined the Patreon, you're probably also the kind of person who thinks that the word regulated in the Second Amendment refers to federal regulations. So join the Patreon. Like, share, subscribe, and until next time, trust God and keep your powder dry.